Good afternoon. I am Ernesto Cedillo of the Center for the Study of Globalization. I have been kindly invited by Professor Shapiro to be the moderator of this roundtable that we are about to start. But before I do that, let me express, as I know many people today are expressing, our gratitude and recognition to Whitney Macmillan, to Betty Macmillan, for all the extraordinary support that they have provided over many years to our university, in particular in fostering the interest, the training, the education of students, and the research of faculty in areas of international studies. The story is very long, and I will not repeat it, of course, because that is not my duty, Professor Shapiro, but I really want to say you thank you. It is not only because of you that we have the Macmillan Center, but I should tell you that this great couple is really at the origin of my own center. They were the largest benefactors for the creation of the Center for the Study of Globalization, and their generous support gave life to our activities over many years. So that is why I am so pleased and so honored and so grateful to be made of this program that we have this afternoon, and that happily has many chapters. It is a real celebration. Well, but you know, economics is the dismal science, right? And I am afraid that given the profession and given the topic, we will have to try to get very serious this afternoon, because my colleagues and I have been invited to have a conversation about a topic that it is very much in the rather disappointing way in which the global economy and most of its constituent parts have been behaving over the last many years. Now we can say that. As we all know, starting with the subprime crisis in 2007, but really accelerating with the eruption of the great financial crisis in the fall of 2008, the global economy has had a rather disappointing performance. It is true that the Great Depression that some people were fearing could happen in the fall of 2008 and the early months of 2009 didn't happen. But it is equally true that the global economy, after recovery in 2010, has had a very disappointing performance. Very slow growth in developed countries for a long time. On average, global growth went up in 2010, and driven mostly by the performance of the so-called emerging economies. But one very interesting aspect of this crisis and its sequel is what happened before the crisis, as typically has happened in history. There was a process of severe debt accumulation in some of the large economies of the world. And what economists had studied and observed historically is that after the eruption of the crisis, the adjustment that has to be taken in face of the crisis, this process of debt accumulation will start to reverse, at least gradually. Well, what happened is that before the eruption of the crisis, for 7, 8 years, the ratio of global debt to global product had grown in more than 1/5, which is huge in such a short period of time. Well, it is interesting that since the crisis erupted, or since the subprime crisis started to happen, the global debt to GDP has continued to grow, and it has grown in almost 1/5. And this is very worrisome, because we were supposed to be by now digested that episode of the debt accumulation, and with that, the economies should be having a more healthy performance than the one we have observed. And in fact, the story has become more complicated in the last 3 or 4 years, because as I mentioned, in 2010, the emerging economies had already started to be the driver of the global economy, but now that story is over. China is growing considerably less than it had grown in the 20, 25 years before the crisis. The new normal, and some people think it is optimistic for China, is growth of 6%. I heard the president of China 2 years ago saying we will grow at 7%. I saw him again in November. I said, well, between 6 and 7%. I don't know what he would say next time I have the opportunity to listen to him. But that is not the whole story. The other side of the story is that over these years, post-crisis, the ratio of debt to GDP in China has quadrupled. Now China is one of the most leveraged economies in the world. But the story continues. Countries that used to be considered also great engines of global growth, like Brazil. Brazil last year and this year is literally in a state of depression. The Brazilian economy contracted 3.8% last year, and it will contract again the same. And the debt to GDP is also growing and growing. And I could continue the story, but the bottom line is that we are in trouble. And part of the story is what has happened with debt, and quite frankly, we don't really envision yet how this vicious cycle of lack of demand, weak growth, and increasing indebtedness in the world is going to be stopped. And there are, of course, as many points of view as economies there are in the world. But basically, I would say there are two broad camps, the heterodox camp and the not so heterodox camp. So we have always these discussions about how to go about this question, and I don't really know. But I think I am very lucky that this afternoon I will have the opportunity, and of course you will have the opportunity, to listen to three distinguished scholars who have done outstanding work in at least areas of concern for the problem at hand. We have Professor Catherine Dominguez, who is a professor of economics and public policy at the University of Michigan. We have Professor Andrew Metrick, who is the Michael H. Jordan Professor at the School of Management. And we have the famous Professor John G. Kopoulos, the James Tobin Professor at the Department of Economics, and who is, as I said, one of the greatest scholars on these subjects. You know, he is a scholar who has developed this theory of cycle of leverage, which I think comes very fit to think about these issues. So what I will do is first to invite Professor Dominguez. She has been doing, well, for a long time, relevant research for our problem. But most recently, she has been thinking about the question of exchange rates and reserves. And this comes very relevant to our topic because, as I mentioned, the problem of emerging countries. And I would say your recent work is thought more about emerging countries, is becoming extremely policy relevant. And after that, I will go to Professor Metric, and then to John G., and then we will have perhaps a brief interchange, and more importantly, we will be awaiting your comments and questions. Thank you. Catherine?
Well, thank you for that nice introduction. And I have to say, I was here as a graduate student a century ago, and that was not when there were funds to send graduate students abroad to do their research. So I feel like I'd need a do-over. I'd like to take advantage of that. This is just a wonderful thing to have done, and I imagine that's really going to be wonderful for the graduate students in the future. So I have been working on the question of under what circumstances governments can manage or influence their exchange rates. And most of my early work was really looking at the U.S. and how the U.S. affects the value of the dollar. More recently, I've been looking at this question more from the point of view of emerging market countries. And the issue of influencing exchange rates for many countries is very much tightly bound with their decisions about accumulating foreign reserves. So what do I mean by foreign reserves? So we define those as assets that are denominated in a foreign currency and that are highly liquid. So in practice, what this means for most countries is holdings of U.S. Treasury securities or holdings of euro-denominated European bonds. So given that our panel is discussing global debt, in some ways, for emerging markets, sovereign debt, and especially sovereign debt issued by advanced economies that in markets that are very liquid, are part of the policy strategy that they use to manage their exchange rates. And indeed, China, since you already brought up China, China is the leader of the pack. Currently, it has about $3.2 trillion. Nobody really knows. The data is a little sketchy, but it's not all in U.S. Treasury securities, but a good portion of it is. They are not the only country that has a huge arsenal of foreign reserves. Most emerging markets, likewise, have always had reserves, but have really grown those reserves in the last few years. And then we even have countries like Switzerland and Japan who have really built up their foreign reserves in the last few years in their attempts to try to manage their currencies. So the idea is, of course, if a country wants to forestall an appreciation or strengthening of their currency, what they're going to be doing is buying, for example, U.S. Treasury securities and selling their own domestic securities on the market, trying to attempt to bring down, stop their currency from appreciating or strengthening. And importantly, it also goes the other way when a country is trying to forestall the depreciation or a devaluation of their currency. They're going to use those reserves as their sort of backstop for their currency. They're going to end up selling those reserves to try to stop the decline in their currency. And we have a lot of examples in the 1990s in particular. And Ernesto, sorry to say, I'm going to have to bring up Mexico here.
Just be careful.
I'm sure you had nothing to do with this, but Mexico is often the example used in the 1990s of a country that had a fairly sizable reserve portfolio when the peso exchange rate was being attacked by speculators, and they found, much to their distress, that their arsenal was not large enough. And in fact, the peso devalued by 40%.
I wish it had been that.
50%. 60%, so big numbers. And then we had a number of countries in East Asia basically following Mexico's lead later in the 1990s, all being subject to devaluation attacks, all of them basically having to have given up on their currency after thinking that they had a fairly sizable foreign reserve portfolio and learning that it was not large enough. In the aftermath of those crises, we saw emerging markets take as a lesson from that experience that they needed to build up their reserve portfolios even more than they had before. And China, again, is the leader of the pack, but most other emerging markets have followed suit and have really built up huge portfolios of, again, mostly dollar, but also euro and yen denominated assets, mostly government securities. So then that brings us up to the global crisis in 2008, 2009. So many of these countries had built up fairly sizable portfolios of assets. These were kind of like a rainy day fund of sorts. If a country was in crisis, they had this large portfolio of assets that they could presumably use, both to suggest to investors that they would be able to hold on to the value of their currency, but also that they had resources in times of crisis. So I did quite a bit of work after the crisis to look to see whether or not countries that had really built up sizable reserve portfolios, whether or not they actually fared better than countries that had not gone that route, had not built up quite as large reserves. And the story is a happy one for China, at least in that case, that in fact it looks like many of the countries that did in fact build up fairly large reserve portfolios did do better during the crisis, seemed to handle the crisis better than countries that did not. So on an individual country-by-country basis, it looks like countries actually did better by having built up reserves. We can talk sort of more generally about whether or not on a global basis it's a good idea for countries to feel the need to build up these large reserve portfolios, in part to try to convince speculators that, in fact, they'll be able to hold on to the value of their currency. So that I'll hold that question out for Q&A, but I think it's an interesting one. So let me move forward in time to where we are now. So as Ernesto suggested, total accumulated debt, global debt currently, is higher than it was at the start of the crisis. And the countries that have really been the big drivers of this large increase in global debt this time are the emerging markets. And again, China is probably the leader of the pack. Its current debt to GDP ratio is fairly comparable to the debt to GDP ratio in the United States and Europe, but it's sizably higher than it was prior to the crisis. So two things. One is the size, and because China is so large, it has really added to the global debt levels, but also the trajectory, just how quickly debt levels have increased in China. The other aspect of the current situation, which I find really interesting, is it's not Chinese government debt that has been built up. It's private sector debt in China, and in particular, it's non-financial, non-banking firms that have built up the debt. And so there's a very open question. So if it's a government that's built up debt, we have a number of different ways we could imagine a government deciding to respond to that, to a crisis. It's a little bit less clear what the role of the Chinese government would be if, in fact, a number of the companies with these high debt levels find themselves unable to service the debt. There's nothing that says that the Chinese government would necessarily bail out those firms, and they certainly have the resources to do so, but exactly how they would go about it is an open question, which I think a lot of people are concerned about not knowing how exactly that might play out. So actually that is an area that my current research is really focused on, is when the debt levels are really coming from the private sector and are not sovereign debt. We've had lots of experience with sovereign debt crises, and we have ideas about what might transfigure, what exactly happens and what the stages are. We're a little bit less, there's been less experience with what happens if most of the debt is private sector debt, and exactly whether or not reserves might be brought into play to bail out the firms, and exactly how the whole process might play out. So I'll stop there, and maybe we can talk more about this in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Andrew.
If this room is big enough for a microphone. I'm just going to leave the microphone aside, and we'll see if people have any trouble hearing me. I'm going to talk about our panel's global debt and one of the connections to it, which would be financial stability, and the relationship between those two things, or more broadly between debt and financial stability, which is a very important connection, the most important connection, probably the most important predictor for financial stability. And it's going to be, I think, quite closely related to some of the things that Catherine discussed. We've run a lot of regressions. We've done a lot of statistical analyses trying to figure out what predicts whether a financial crisis happens. And these are worldwide, cross-country studies over long time periods. There's one main result that always comes out, which is that high levels of debt or leverage, in John's language, predict financial crises. There's other sub-results in there. That's the only big one. And we're learning more recently, well, it's short-term debt seems to be a more important predictor than overall debt, perhaps. Mortgage debt is a most important component of overall debt that predicts financial crises, but it's debt. And particularly when you get an acceleration in the debt levels, and these are country by country, that's when you see a much higher likelihood of a crisis. So people have understood this intuitively for a long time, and there have been, I would say, case studies of people studying this back for a while. Only in recent years do we have the kind of data sets that enable us to test these things more precisely. Reinhardt and Rogoff did a lot of important work. Recently, Alan Taylor and a variety of colleagues have constructed a fantastic data set with historical data going back to the late 19th century across, depending on how long you want to go far back, 14 and 20 of the largest countries in the world, all kind of giving these same predictors. And so that means we know we need to understand, why does that happen? Why do we see these increases in debt? And there's two main intellectual traditions, I would say. One that is an older intellectual tradition that has recently had some fantastic work, I think anchored by John G. here to my right, which is on, let's call it, the demand side for funds. So people who want to be able to borrow in order to be able to invest. So a lot of this is driven by expectations of high future returns. It tends to be equity-driven debt a lot of times. So you want to invest and you need to borrow a lot of money because you have a limited equity pool to be able to make that investment. Or if you're going to end up holding the debt, you're just pretty convinced everything's going to go swimmingly in the future and your debt will be worth 100 cents on the dollar. It tends to be related very much to the study of bubbles. And it's one very important side of the equation, and it's one that people have been talking about for a long time. But I would say only recently are we starting to see models that are very satisfying, starting with John's. The other piece to it, which is a somewhat more recent area of study, and it is there's contributors from finance, from macroeconomics, from international finance. Catherine, coming from those last two categories, right in this area, which is coming, let's say, more about the supply of funds or the demand for what those funds can be built into in terms of bonds. Catherine talked about how when emerging markets, such as China, we also saw it in the Middle East, build up surpluses, they really like to hold a lot of those things in stuff that's safe, stuff they don't have to think about. It really economizes on your information production to just be able to hold debt that's safe debt. Ben Bernanke talked in the mid-2000s, before the crisis, about there being perhaps a global savings glut. And he was speaking about that in the context of why it might be they were doing all these things with short rates, but long rates weren't moving. There's a lot of people who are demanding nice, safe debt. But the broader, bigger picture is that the huge demands for the safe debt, so it's not coming from people who necessarily want to invest in new real projects and have great expectations about the future, but people who are sitting around with a lot of cash and want to put some of it in a super safe checking account. And the safest checking account is the debt of sovereigns like the United States, like the UK. That's where they want to put their money. So the United States and the UK need to kind of produce some of that. And to the extent that they don't, the private markets need to produce a substitute. I'm going to talk a little bit about that kind of side of the equation, this supply side of the debt and where it might come from, and how the financial system has changed over the last 60 years in a way that now it makes the regulation for central bankers, for people who look at large banks, a very different type of problem and a more complicated problem than we used to have. And that's the area that I'm focused on now, and so I still have more questions than answers. But let me tell you give you a few facts and then talk about what some of those questions are. So the first set of facts I've alluded to, which is Alan Taylor and his co-authors and Reinhart Rogoff's findings that it is debt that predicts financial crises. And I think maybe a more important result from Taylor's work is that if you look up until World War II, across all the largest economies, the amount of, you can either call it debt in the economy or the other side of the balance sheet, the assets of banks, which would be very close to being the debt, the private debt that was in economies at the time, that tracked very closely the old Milton Friedman style measures of the money supply. The world looked kind of the same, didn't really matter. You could look at money supply or you could look at debt/assets in the economy, and you would get similar kinds of predictions, and either one of those things could predict what was going to go on in the macroeconomy and whether you had a financial crisis. Post-World War II, those things have completely decoupled. We've seen a huge financialization in the world economy in terms of the total amount of assets that are out there or bank debt that's out there, different sides of the balance sheet, even divided by GDP. Whereas the money supply's ratio with GDP has stayed relatively constant. And indeed, it is the debt side that is the predictor of stuff, including financial crises, whereas the monetary predictors don't seem to work well anymore. So we've seen a change in the world, overall kind of cross-country studies. Looking just at the United States, where the data on individual components of this financialization are much better. The Federal Reserve's been doing a better job than our European friends, and I yell at my European friends about this, at things like flow of funds, so we can decompose things, is that if you go back to 1952 and you trace, starting with trying to understand the financialization of the economy, you'll see that the ratio of total assets in the economy to GDP went from 4-to-1 to almost 10-to-1. So there's a lot more assets. We have a kind of more asset-intensive economy. The financial assets to GDP, so financial assets are a subset of total assets. Your house is an asset, but the mortgage on it is a financial asset. There'll be some double counting that goes on here. Financial assets have gone from about 1 times GDP to 4.5 times GDP. So they were about a quarter of all assets in 1952. And by now, they're like almost a half. So there's been this huge change in overall asset intensity and how much it gets used, and the fraction of them are financial assets. During that same time period, where the financial assets have grown tremendously. We don't see anything that looks like a stable world in terms of its use of assets. The percentage of those of all financial assets that you could call loosely safe assets. Think of things that get ratings of AAA. Government debt, AAA mortgage securities when we thought those were AAA, agency debt, money market mutual funds. Add all of that up, divide it by the total amount of assets, which remember, financial assets which have been exploding, and you get a number that is almost exactly 33%, plus or minus 1 or 2% almost every year, going back to 1952. So while the world has been changing kind of in this crazy way in our use of financial assets, the fraction of them that are safe, or kind of something that we would call safe, has stayed relatively constant. Almost like you need to have, if you're a country and you have a whole lot of reserves, some fraction of them just need to be in something that you don't have to think about. Just like we're all told, keep a certain amount of our portfolio in cash and a certain amount in stocks. The composition, however, of what we call safe assets has changed remarkably. So we have this island of stability, which is the fraction of all assets, financial assets that are safe. But the composition of it has changed tremendously. In 1952, 80% of what we would call safe assets were deposits sitting in banks. Okay? And in that kind of world, if you tell a bank what to do, and you give rules for banks, or you break up banks, or you do whatever you want to banks, you can have a very large effect on what's going on in the financial system. Because they're 80% of where people were getting their safety. By the time of the financial crisis, it was less than 40% was coming from banks, and 60% from other places. And what are those other places? Securitized bonds, often mortgage-backed securities, money market mutual funds, which had grown to a $4 trillion industry as compared to $10 trillion on the balance sheets of banks on the eve of the crisis. A lot of things that are asset-backed commercial paper, for example, things that are substitutes in some sense for the super safe stuff that we can have in banks. And in fact, at very short horizons, you see exactly that. So if China suddenly gets an influx of cash for whatever reason, because they're running a large budget surplus, and they put that in U.S. government and agency securities, the people who used to have those U.S. government agency securities would like to demand, the data tell us, a substitute for them that's also nice and safe. And you can see at very short horizons, for example, that if the U.S. government, because it had a lot of tax receipts in a week, issues less debt that week for reasons totally exogenous to the financial system, you see more issuance that week of asset-backed commercial paper, more issuance that week of mortgage-backed securities that pull together mortgages that have been sitting in warehouses for a long time. The financial system is very, very good at manufacturing safe assets when the market demands it. And a lot of what we saw happen in the build-up to the financial crisis was coming from this side. You need to have both, as Marshall's a famous economist from the early 20th century, and he talked about demand and supply as the two pieces of the scissors.
Andrew?
I'm done?
John G. gets very mad when a colleague steals his time.
Okay, you're up. I'm done.
Andrew, I was enjoying that.
The finishing point was this is a rich area of study right now. It's trying to understand in a world where the borders between banks and all other financial institutions are thin, and you go back and forth real fast, what do you do as a central banker to regulate, to manage the money supply, to manage the amount of leverage that's in the economy?
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to continue with what both previous speakers were discussing. And as Ernesto said, the vast majority of crises are tied to debt. And the last two we've seen were the subprime mortgage crisis in the US and now the European crisis, the sovereign debt crisis going on in Europe that's had a horrible effect, especially in Southern Europe. And the mortgage crisis, by the way, in America, as you know, caused it's called the Great Recession, the worst financial downturn since the Great Depression. Debt also causes individual problems, as anyone who's a student at Yale is fully aware of, and student debt. But debt's also historically an extremely important topic. Islam doesn't permit lending at interest. The Bible talks over and over about the harms of lending at interest. Shakespeare talked about lending at interest. Nietzsche explained in The Genealogy of Morals that morality itself is due to the concept of debt. The German word for debt, Schuld, is, should. It's also the word for conscience in German, the old word for conscience. Many famous rulers have forgiven debt. Hammurabi forgave debt. The Babylonians, Solon, the lawgiver in Athens, forgave debt. Caesar forgave debt. As a Yale sociologist who's no longer here pointed out, the Rosetta Stone, everyone knows about the Rosetta Stone. What was so important about it that it had to be translated into 3 languages, which is why we know what hieroglyphics are, because it's translated into Demotic, Egyptian and whatever it is, ancient and to Greek. Why did they have to translate into 3 languages? Well, they were forgiving debt, and they wanted everybody to know. So philosophers, there was Ptolemy V. Philosophers, anthropologists, historians, political scientists, economists, they're all, even mathematicians, you talked about the predictors of crises, even mathematicians are trying to figure out what's the signature of debt. So it's not so surprising that we've started a program in global debt here, or in debt anyway, at the Macmillan Center, and hopefully it will bring together a lot of different people from different fields who can study debt in all its different aspects. Now, debt is the engine of growth, but it's also the cause of our worst financial crises. So it's not so surprising that the most powerful institutions, at least financial institutions, many of any kind of institution, are the central banks. They've got to manage the debt and balance this growth versus avoiding catastrophe. But obviously they're doing something wrong. We've had too many catastrophes. So what is it that they do wrong? Well, the first thing is, if you just read the newspapers, they're always talking about the interest rate. When the crisis happened, the subprime crisis, Ben Bernanke lowered the interest rates to 0. They're still basically 0. For 7 years, we've had the interest rates at 0. And now they're talking about, well, maybe the economy's going to pick up, so they're going to raise the interest rates. They're going to lower the interest rates. They're going to raise the interest rates. That's what the central bank does. It manages the interest rates. But there's a lot more to debt than the interest rate. There's the terms of the debt. When you borrow money, as Andrew was talking about on a mortgage, the cause of the central predictor, he was saying, and all his different kinds of debt, you don't worry about just what the interest rate is on the mortgage. You worry about how much you can borrow on the house. Can you borrow 80% of it or 90% of it? The bank wants to know your FICO score. If you're a company borrowing money, they want to know your credit rating. I don't know if you can put a picture up. So how is it that that never comes up in the newspapers about the central banks? How come they never talk about what I call the credit surface? So you got that to, he said, anyway, I had somehow compressed the picture into a little dot, and I had given up in despair. And he was willing to bet his raise that he could. So I hope they give you a generous one. Anyway, this is a picture of all the Fannie and Freddie loans from 2013. If you look at the FICO score of every single borrower, you can see it go, like you can even read it. It's 800 in the near corner, and the lower number, 650 in the far corner. And loan to value is really bad, 95% in the 100% in the far corner, and 50% in the near corner. So you see, just these are the best borrowers in America. You see, I averaged over all of them in little buckets and made the best fit. You see that in the near corner, they pay a very low interest rate. When they're high credit quality and lots of collateral, they pay a very low interest rate. As the credit quality goes bad, they pay a higher interest rate. What could be a simpler idea? Every business person, takes this into account in making a loan. A loan is about trust. Is the guy reliable or the borrower reliable or not reliable? The less reliable, the higher the interest rate's going to be. When they say credit conditions are tight, what do they mean? Not that the interest rate's high or low. In the newspapers or with the Fed making pronouncements, you've got no idea what it means. But what they ought to mean is that the credit surface is steep. The most interesting borrowers are the ones who are doing something a little bit risky. So they're going to be charged a higher interest rate. As that steepness goes up, that's the sign that credit conditions are tight. And the flatter it gets, that's the sign that credit is easy. And people are going to be borrowing a lot of money to do a lot of all kinds of things, some of which might be very good and some of which might be more risky. Okay, so the next thing, so we've got to pay attention to the terms of credit, not just the interest rate. The next thing is that the terms of credit affect prices of assets. Andrew was saying, why is it that the amount of debt and stuff like that is a good predictor? Well, one of the things he's measuring, either directly or indirectly, is the loan to value, the ratio of the amount borrowed to the value of the collateral backing it or to income backing it. As that number gets higher, that means people are willing to loan at easier conditions. That's an incredibly good predictor of asset prices. In fact, they almost go simultaneously. It's amazing that hardly anybody talked about this 20 years ago. You could find a few actually famous economic historians who talked about it, but aside from them, and who pays attention to economic historians? Sorry, we've got a great economic historian there. Besides a couple economic historians, it almost never came up in models or anything like that. But that's a fundamental relationship. Terms of credit getting easier, it means people can borrow money to buy assets. The asset prices go up. There's a sign of something that's getting heated or maybe overheated in the economy. Tuition, it's a big mystery. Why has tuition skyrocketed in America so much in the last 15 years? It's astronomical increases. Well, the government made it possible to borrow to go to school. It's like the leverage on going to school on colleges went way up, and so the prices of tuition went way up. Okay, now I'm running out of time, so let me talk about forgiveness. So debt overhang, as Catherine and Ernesto pointed out, that's a real cause of why the economies languish after one of these debt explosions and crises. We just never, how can you get out of debt overhang? By forgiving some of the debt, by admitting you're not going to get it back and forgiving the part that you weren't going to get anyway. But we never forgave debt in the subprime crisis. It's astonishing we didn't forgive debt. A house that was worth, maybe it was worth a lot, it fell in value to $100,000, but the loan is still there at $160,000, worth way more than the house. Of course, the subprime borrower with a bad credit rating was going to default. So we could have forgiven 160 down to 90, and less than the value of the house, probably would have gotten the 90 back. Instead, none of it was forgiven. Not a single penny of subprime debt was forgiven. So the homeowner hung on, didn't pay his mortgage, didn't pay his taxes, didn't fix the house. The average recovery on all subprime loans was 25%, $40,000 in that case. Instead of getting the 90, because we hung on and didn't forgive, we got 40. Okay, the Europeans haven't forgiven, the official sector hasn't forgiven debt in Europe yet, even though it's obvious some of those countries can't pay. So why is it? Well, the central banks, they don't even acknowledge that they might not get the money back. They don't even have a language to say it. When they mark their positions, the positions are marked as if they're going to get all the money back. Of course, if you mark a loan at 160, and you forgive it down to 90, you have to take a dramatic loss. But if you had recognized from the beginning you were only going to get 40, you could mark it at 90, forgive it down to 90, and you'd be making money, not losing money. That's the reason why they don't forgive debt. So let's take the example of Greece. That's going to end with this. So my family's Greek, so I've tried a little bit to, I've consulted a little bit with the Greek government about trying to get their debt forgiven.
Very good job.
And it hasn't gone so well. So nothing's been forgiven. But anyway, let's take America as a good example. After World War II, America had this horrendous debt from the World War, 104% debt to GDP. Amazingly, we paid it down to 23% by 1973. That's one of the great achievements of the whatever generation it's called, the something generation. They're so great. Anyway, so they paid it down. But we owed all the debt to ourselves. We had a booming economy with under 5% unemployment most of that time, even down to in the threes. We had a young population. Greece has a 200% almost debt to GDP. It owes it all to foreigners. It has a 24.4% unemployment. It's been over 20% for 4.5 years. It's got a currency that's frozen in the euro, so it can't devalue its currency. If it did devalue its currency, it would mean the debt would go up because the value of the drachma would be lower, so the same debt would be worth much more. So it's got like a 300% debt to GDP ratio. It's got a horribly aging population, and it's got a refugee crisis. But they're not forgiving the debt yet. So what is the plan in Greece? Greece is supposed to pay back. The IMF has calculated in June, there was this terrible negotiation, and Greece threatened to do all sorts of things like leave the euro and then back down and embarrassingly gave up on its threats. And so they agreed to pay 3.5% of their GDP as debt payments for 30 or 40 years. That's how they're going to pay back the debt. The primary surplus now, that the surplus that they have to pay is 0% now. They've just agreed on a huge tax increase with the IMF to get to 1.5%. And they're about to have this voted in Parliament any day now. And then on top of that, they've got to raise more taxes to get it to 3.5%. They're being asked to raise conditional taxes. To promise now that you'll raise a tax later if such and such happens. And it's not even clear it's legal. Anyway, that's where the negotiation is now. No free country in history has paid 3.5% of its GDP for 30 years to foreigners. That's why I say free country. For 6 consecutive years, if we show the next picture, the IMF has made predictions. So at the low point you can see the years, at the low point of each of these curves, the IMF said, oh, things are bad, they're going to get better very soon. So of course you can pay a big percentage. And you can see that every year things, instead of turning up, they actually turn down. Now we're at this bottom thing where, again, last June they were predicting that it was going to go right up, and so Greece could pay this 3.5%. Well, the fact is, things haven't gone up, and even the IMF has realized that, and they say, okay, enough is enough. 1.5% is all that they can pay, and since that won't cover the debt that's outstanding, the Europeans should forgive the debt so that 1.5% does cover it. So why don't they forgive it? Well, they never forgive it. It's just no one forgave subprime debt in America. The Europeans are refusing to forgive. The Germans, anyway, are refusing to forgive. There are others, too. But some of them want to forgive. But why? What's the argument for not forgiving? Well, a promise is a promise. How can we, you don't want to report losses to Parliament now. That's the same banker's problem of not marking things down. You don't want to give Greece a deal that others who could pay would demand. Those are the reasons for not to forgive. So the question is, how do you construct a deal where the Greeks think their debt has been forgiven, but the Europeans can say, well, we didn't forgive it. All right, so there are 2 ideas. I'm going to end with this. 2 ideas here. One is to stop the constant renegotiations where things always turn out to be worse than expected, and of course they can't do what they're supposed to have done, and then there's a huge renegotiation, everybody's screaming at everybody. Make a plan that they can do. So make the debt payment contingent on how the country's doing, on what unemployment is. So for example, if unemployment's over 25%, which it has been, you don't have to pay anything back. And every time unemployment drops a little, you have to pay more. So maybe 0.1% of surplus gets paid every time unemployment drops 1%. So if you go from 25 to 10, you drop 15%, that's 1.5% of GDP you have to pay then in your debt payments. Or maybe you can make it a little tougher on the Greeks and make it go up a little faster. But the first idea is the thing Greece should have to pay shouldn't depend on when bonds are coming due and stuff like that. It should depend, and not even a fixed number, it should depend on how unemployment's doing. If the country's crushed, it can't pay, and you're just going to get the same renegotiation all the time. It seems like a simple idea. That's the first thing. Okay, then the second thing is, if you do this plan, that's a lot less even than the 1.5%, forever starting right now that the IMF is asking for. If you do that, Greece will never pay off its debt. You can't have a country that's permanently in debt. They're not going to pay off anyway. So how do you balance this? Get the Germans to forgive while thinking they're not forgiving yet. So they have to recognize that eventually they won't get the money back, or they'll never give anything. So if they recognize that, which I'm sure they do, here's a suggestion. Every time Greece actually pays $1, you count it as $3. So you pay back $1, you get the dollar you paid back, and you also get forgiven $2 more. Now, Greece can immediately say, we got 2/3 of our debt written off. But the Germans, who don't think the Greeks are going to pay anything back, because they haven't yet, they don't have to do it until the money comes in. So they can forgive very slowly, and they actually have to get cash in their hands before they forgive anything. They're getting something. And now, if you're a Greek thinking of selling off an island, you're not going to do it if the debt is infinite. You're just going to give away an island that's going to pay infinity to infinity minus epsilon. But if you think you can actually pay the debt down, you might see them doing a lot more dramatic things than they've done yet, and actually getting the country galvanized. So there's
Well, when we engage in magical solutions, which sometimes are needed, is that we are in deep trouble already, right? And I think that is
the issue right now. When we think about the process that could unravel in China, for example, or in any other major economy because of this debt overhang. Well, the problem of Greece, which is a very serious, not only economic, but also human problem, will look as a truly minor problem because the human cost, economic cost that we have seen in Greece will be multiplied manifold. So I don't know whether the demand-driven view or the supply-driven view is right, but today we have a very serious problem. And I think our responsibility, in addition to think hard about what happened in history, to produce better models with better explanatory power and try to see whether they are sustained empirically, is to push a little bit harder towards possible policy solutions. Because the problem, as we have discussed here, is not getting better, and more we see paralysis from the part of government institutions to address these issues. We are really in a vicious cycle where economies don't grow, debts don't come down, and therefore the size of the debt relative to the size of the economy is getting worse. So the question is, do we need to go rather sooner than later through another major crisis that probably will be worse than the previous one before institutions react and take the necessary decisions, or this modeling through the problem at the end is going to provide escape speed and make and somehow the processes of adjustment will allow economies to finally start growing. Well, who knows? But what we also know is that there are some structural conditions, particularly in developed economies, that may point out to the fact that irrespective of any improvement in financial conditions, those economies may be prone today to less growth, much less than in the past. And that's a big problem, because precisely at a time that we need more growth, the demographics and probably the stagnation in productivity growth will play against the growth of the overall economy. So that means that the effort has to be even bigger. And I say this to confirm to you that this is the dismal science. So I don't know if any of you want to make a comment on what your colleagues have said, or we should open the floor now. I think we should open the floor to questions or comments at this point. Anybody wants to give a note of optimism? You will have an extra drink if you...
Sorry.
Thank you. I have a question for John Giannakopoulos. So you said that the whole situation with the Greek debt is a promise. That's what the justification is for not forgiving the debt, right? And indeed, the whole debate has moral and even religious connotations sometimes, right? So Greece failed, and it has to pay for its original sin, and it has to suffer, even though if it suffers, nobody really wins. But anyway, so I'm asking, when is this original sin, actually? When did it take place? Wasn't it in 2012 with the haircut on the Greek debt? Back then, the debt was held by private banks across the world, or mostly Europe, and then suddenly it became, from an economic It became a political issue when Greece got locked into the official sector. And then if we have to like assess the role of the IMF, as you showed, they have failed miserably in making predictions about the future. If the IMF's mandate is to help countries in distress into balancing their budgets, right, and making the lives of their citizens better in cases where the debt has risen so high, the fact that the IMF actually intervenes in favor of the creditors and not in favor of helping a country reach debt forgiveness, then how is its mandate served nowadays? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. I'll respond to both of them. So a lot of the Greek debt was, a lot of French and German banks had, how did Greece get in so much debt? Well, a lot of French and German banks lent them a huge amount of money, and they were already having problems with the American subprime stuff that they had bought, and now on top of that, the Greeks were going to default against them, and so the bailout basically bailed out, the European bailout, among other things, bailed out the French and German banks and replaced, the official sector stood in place of the French and European banks, and then Greece owed the money to the official sector instead of to the private sector. Now, the private sector, what was left of the private sector has taken a haircut. A lot of private lenders, they lost around 50%, they forgave 50% of the money. The official sector hasn't forgiven anything. So why is it that the official sector, which you would think of would be more merciful and more reasonable, more benevolent, because they're not just profit-oriented, they want the harmony of Europe, you would think they would be kinder and wiser than the private sector? Well, it turns out that, the profit motive, it's a pretty good motive for getting people to make reasonable decisions. When you take the profit motive out of it, you sometimes get less merciful decisions. So in the American subprime mortgage crisis, 17 hedge funds testified in Congress that they wanted to forgive the debt. It would make more money for them to forgive the debt. But they weren't allowed to forgive the debt because they couldn't coordinate, and the government didn't step in to help them coordinate to forgive the debt. So the private sector is often better than the official sector. But this is a failure of governance. This is something that hopefully work at places like the Macmillan Center will solve. There'll be some way of thinking about it so the official sector can get better. Now, the IMF has been a disaster, but actually they're Greece's best friend now, in a way. They're being very tough on the Greeks, but they're the only ones who are saying unequivocally the debt should be forgiven. Greece can't pay it. We declare as our expert opinion, Greece cannot pay the debt. And many of the Europeans agree with them privately, but haven't said it publicly. And there's some Europeans who don't agree with them, think Greece can pay it. So actually, I think the trick in these negotiations is to marshal the IMF on behalf of Greece. And they're being incredibly difficult with Greece now. They're trying to prove a point. They want Greece to confess that it can't make the 3.5%. The Greeks feel duty-bound to keep their word and say, we can make the 3.5%, and once you see us do it, then you'll forgive the debt. But it's a little bit crazy, that posture. What? Catch-22, yeah. They want to show that they're good guys and they're keeping their promise, but once they show it, the Germans are going to say, well, you can pay it. So the IMF is actually going to play a crucial role here, I think, in getting the debt forgiven if it does get forgiven. So I think they learned a lesson. This was an incredibly embarrassing, look at that. That couldn't, what, dismal science. This is just embarrassing. Every year they were wrong. 30% mistake. You can't make 30% mistakes over a couple of years. It's incredibly embarrassing. So of course, they're going to be better now, I hope.
We have time for just one more question.
This is perhaps for Professor Dominguez. You had indicated that global debt is higher than it was during the financial crisis. Can you elaborate a bit on the role of the ratings agencies? When they issue their reports on the different countries, are they only looking on the government debt or also on the privately held debt? And so how are we going, if they are not doing their job, how are we going to get this issue under control?
So the credit rating companies do both rate the private sector as well as sovereigns. But it is an interesting question. They're not really looking at the overall picture. They're looking at specific issuers of debt and telling us whether or not they're creditworthy or not. Now that we've moved to most of the large increase in debt since the financial crisis is mostly from emerging markets, whereas obviously before the crisis it was more from the advanced economies. And it tends, much of it is, not all of it, but much of it is private sector debt. So again, it gets tricky because you could have different credit ratings for different companies within a country. And then just to make things even more complicated, a goodly number of these are in China, where kind of corporate governance and transparency is less clear than it might be in other countries. So I don't know if that's answering your question, but the part of the issue is that the buildup of debt has been more from the private sector than the government sector in this most recent period.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to conclude the session. Just let me say that one element that perhaps would deserve an additional session will be the topic of international coordination. I think this crisis happened to some extent, but not only, because countries failed to coordinate before the crisis erupted to prevent the huge disequilibria that was happening during those years. When the crisis came, they came together into the G20, and in November of 2008, first point was to recognize that the lack of coordination, the lack of coherence among these countries was at least part of the explanation of the crisis. They pledged to coordinate, and indeed they coordinated at the beginning. I think that prevented the first Great Depression of the 21st century. To some extent, central banks have kept some degree of coordination. There has been some coordination through the Financial Stability Board for aspects of financial reforms, but not so much. Basically, US and Europe have gone their own way, and the UK. The idea of coordination has practically disappeared from the G20. And I think the fact that this is happening will make much harder to deal with these issues. The question that John G. has raised about Europe and the specific topic of Greece, I think fundamentally it's a problem of macroeconomic policy coordination. The Germans have been worse than the Chinese before the crisis in accumulating huge current account surpluses. And today, by any measure, they are much worse because Germany has a current account surplus of 7% of GDP, and that is a source of serious disequilibria. And as John G. said, nobody is really talking about attacking some of the root causes of this issue because simply some countries want to free ride on the actions of others. If we are going to live in a globalized economy, in a globalized or with a globalized financial system, we need international coordination, which I think is a big topic for our Macmillan Center. Thank you very much.